This is Australia. Well, you probably know that already. So Australia is the only major honey-producing country that's free from the varroa mite, the biggest threat to honeybees worldwide. Or rather, Australia was that country until the summer of 2022. And then a nightmare began. In just a few months, while authorities were trying to stop the infection, over 28,000 beehives were destroyed across 250 apiaries. The eradication zones cover more than 4 million acres, or 2% of the territory of New South Wales, where it all started. And just so you understand the scale of those 28,000 hives, each one had between 10,000 and 30,000 bees in it. So on average, about 560 million insects were wiped out. The worst part is that in the infection zone, they destroyed all the hives, regardless of whether they were actually infected or not. And the important thing is that they specifically sent the bees to this total destruction zone to help pollinate crops. But then the mite showed up, and all their efforts went to waste. Besides the death of a lot of bees, many people lost their jobs. Who's this bee killer? And why is he so ruthless? A cup of coffee and we'll figure it all out. Just an unobtrusive reminder to put something up. And thanks to everyone who gets why I do what I do. So it all started, as I already mentioned, in New South Wales. That's an Australian state in the southeast of the country, where Sydney's located. A 31-mile emergency biosecurity zone was created in the state to stop the movement of bees after a deadly parasite, the varroa mite, was discovered. All beekeepers within this zone had to notify the authorities about where their hives were, because if those hives ended up in a 6-mile zone, they would have to be destroyed. The remaining 16 miles made up the area for close monitoring and inspection of domestic and wild honeybees. And all of this because of a parasite, the Varroa destructor mite, the brownish-red arachnids the size of a sesame seed that literally feed on honeybees. Actually, the mite used to prefer Apis cerata, the Asian honeybee, and was relatively harmless. But then it switched to Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, and it turned out that this species just doesn't have good defenses. Although the mite, as you may have guessed, is pretty small, about 0.06 inches wide, it's considered one of the largest parasitic mites in the world relative to its host, since bees are small too. But when you compare the sizes of a bee and a mite, it's pretty creepy. If humans had parasites like that, they'd be the size of a plate. And this plate would crawl on us, bite, and even munch off bits. Yikes! Oh, and keep in mind that these kinds of parasites would prefer not to go after grown-ups, because although varroa mites can feed on and live on adult honeybees, they mainly do all this on the larvae and pupae in developing brood, causing deformities and weakening in adult bees, as well as passing on viruses. Unlike many other mites, these don't drink blood. Instead, they feast on the fat bodies, which are a type of tissue found in both adult bees and larvae. If you don't intervene in time, an infestation of varroa mites will lead to the death of the entire colony of honeybees. Of course, this happens gradually. These mites latch onto bees and eat them alive, which definitely has a big effect on the insects. But it's not just about the eating, it's also about the viruses that mites can pass along to the insects. There are at least 5 of them, and the worst one is the deformed wing virus. Bees that are infected show signs of deformed wings, shortened bodies, altered coloration, and occasionally they may become completely paralyzed. Basically, insects that are bitten by mites become weaker, and the weaker the bee gets, the shorter its lifespan becomes. Fewer and fewer bees are able to gather nectar and pollen, and the ones that are left become more susceptible to other pests and diseases. Eventually, there are so few bees that the hive can no longer function, and it dies off. Even though we've been aware of varroa mites for some time, scientists now believe these mites are way more dangerous than we thought before. That's because they recently found out the mites actually consume organs. Before, it was assumed they only fed on blood. And judging by what scientists are seeing right now, the future doesn't look too bright. It's expected that over the next 5 years, mites will wipe out most wild European honeybees of Australia. Commercial fruit crops like apples, pears, and cherries are also at risk, along with all the gardens and vegetable patches in private yards, as well as local forests that rely on wild honeybees freely pollinating the plants. But all this sounds kind of theoretical, you know? A threat like many others. Let's make it clear. If the population of honeybees drops, it'll lead to a decrease in the supply of about 1/3 of the food we eat. that means food prices will skyrocket. And it's all because there won't be anyone to pollinate, well, all the stuff that needs pollinating. Meanwhile, the demand for beehives and bees will keep rising because right now there just aren't any alternatives. No one does this job better than honeybees. It's estimated that they contribute about $14.2 billion a year to crop production through pollination. Without bees, well, that's not just extra costs, it's a total collapse. Not to mention that the lack of bees could seriously harm Australian beekeeping, which has an annual turnover of $147 million. So this is one of those situations where you really need to do something, and do it fast. The problem is that getting rid of mites, or at least stopping their spread, is really hard. That's precisely why the arrival of mites is seen as an invasion. Look at the official map. The orange regions show where mites are now, and the blue regions are where they used to be. But people managed to eliminate them. If strict measures hadn't been taken, the entire state would have been infected. Let's take New Zealand as an example, where these mites were first found in 2000. It only took them 6 years to spread all over both the North and South Islands. In Australia, they didn't even have to cross any water to seize more land. Also, people and some bad luck helped things along. And as always, the idea was fantastic. Duxton Bees, one of the largest companies in Australia, shipped 4,000 of its 7,000 hives up to northwestern Victoria and Riverland for the almond pollination season that lasts from July to August every year. Sounds like a good thing, right? Sure does. And this company isn't the only one. Others have also sent their hives, but many of them were moved from areas around Kempsey, where they were contracted for pollination. Then they found mites in those areas. In the end, all those areas became red zones. But many hives had already been returned to their owners or sent elsewhere. Nobody even thought there'd be a problem because moving bees is a common practice. Every August, almond farmers use 300,000 hives to pollinate the crop, making it the largest movement of insects in the country. They can't skip this. If they miss the bloom, it'll be an economic disaster for almond producers and everyone involved in the process. Just like that, a regular and essential action made the infection spread quickly and cover a vast territory. In addition, the blame lies on modern beekeeping, which involves placing hives very close to each other. This likely speeds up the spread of mites even more. Of course, mites aren't transmitted through the air, but when one colony starts dying off due to an infestation, bees from other hives come over to steal honey, and the mites happily latch on to these new hosts. That's why it was essential to wipe out all the hives in the infected area. You can't really explain to bees that it's risky to fly over there because they might get sick. If people don't always get it, what can you expect from insects? Maybe some of you have wondered, how did these mites even end up in Australia? Why is it just now becoming a problem? Well, that's because mites really weren't around on the continent before. They affect all the main beekeeping areas of the world, but they'd never settled in Australia before. The mite itself is originally from Asia, but since the early 20th century, it spread to North America, the UK, New Zealand, and Hawaii. It's just that globalization has taken off in full swing, and traveling between the most remote corners of our planet's become easier. Ultimately, mites caused major losses in bee colonies all over the globe, but not in Australia. For a long time, the Varroa mite couldn't get into Australia, and we have to thank strict border quarantine measures for that, but even they couldn't keep the pest out forever. It's just too small. Most likely, the tiny critter hitchhiked on some imported goods and then made its way to a colony of honeybees, and that's where it all began. The Varroa mite was first spotted near Newcastle in New South Wales in June 2022. At first, the discovery led New South Wales to impose a quarantine on bees. Honeybees weren't allowed to be moved around the state. Did it help? Maybe, but it still couldn't stop the invasion. As of 2023, since the first discovery of the parasite, there have been more than 260 outbreaks recorded around Newcastle, on the northern coast of New South Wales near Coffs Harbour, and close to the border with Victoria. And then I thought, if mites are so dangerous and have spread all over the world, how come we still have honeybees around? Well, it turns out that some bees are genetically wired to take care of themselves and their fellow bees. They look for and kill mites while grooming themselves, even biting off their legs. Another behavior, known as Varroa-sensitive hygiene, prevents the mites from breeding inside the hive. Varroa mites lay their eggs in brood cells, where honeybee larvae develop. Honeybees with the uninfected genes will check the cells for Varroa mites and then remove the infected larva from the hive. The problem is that commercial bee colonies generally don't have this behavior. At the same time, bees bred for hygiene that are sensitive to varroa don't get much love from beekeepers, since a lot of these bees produce less honey or have fewer worker bees in the hive. Beekeepers usually go for honey. As for the fact that these bees could all die off, they don't really think about that. Why don't they use some kind of poison? There are all sorts of chemicals and other methods to control pests. The problem is that mites develop resistance, and sometimes treatment doesn't work or even backfires. Not to mention the side effects. For example, queen bees lost their ability to lay eggs because of the chemicals. So the best and most sustainable solution is to breed colonies with lots of very clean bees that can resist the mites. The problem is that it's a pretty tricky task. Identifying bees capable of doing this is exhausting. For instance, the standard way to assess their state is to count how many legs of the mites have been chewed off by vigilant bees. And remember, the mites are about the size of a sesame seed, so you need at least a good magnifying glass. Still, if we can spread these bees around and make them a regular part of hives, the global problem with mites might eventually be taken care of. To get more bees like that, experts are now working on artificial insemination. As for Australia, sadly, it's too late to prevent mites from spreading all over the continent. Scientists say they're not trying to stop the spread because it's going to happen anyway. They're just trying to slow it down so beekeepers can get better at what they do and be ready for the mites. Because it's the only way out. Beekeepers will have to learn to live with the deadly varroa mite, especially since in 2023, the government decided to switch from eradication methods to management strategies. It didn't happen overnight. First, the country spent over $100 million trying to wipe out the pest, but scientific data showed that the strategy didn't work. Some beekeepers weren't following the rules. There were new outbreaks and the territory's just too large. In the end, it became clear that trying to eliminate the mites was just pointless. Moreover, scientists now say that all the efforts to wipe them out were probably in vain. All those millions of bees died for nothing. Since the mites showed up on the continent, their spread was pretty much inevitable. If I were the bees, I'd be pretty upset. But there might be one significant upside to the parasite invasion. This plain-looking insect is the Australian bee, and there are more than 2,000 similar species around here, and Australian bees can take advantage of what the mites do. The thing is, honeybees were brought to Australia almost 200 years ago, so they're not native to the continent, but they've adapted really well. Since then, these introduced bees have been actively pushing out local pollinators, and as usual, this can have serious consequences for the ecosystem. Because not all the bees that people use stay in the hives. Australia already has feral populations, and they threaten the biodiversity of the continent just like any invasive species. At the same time, varroa mites that affect honeybees probably can't infect local bees, at all. There's a chance, though, that the mite could bring new insect viruses to Australia, but it's still unknown if this will harm local bees. But it's already clear that mites will probably wipe out the feral population of honeybees, which will definitely do a lot of good for many local ecosystems. But what's the situation with the parasite? There's a really simple solution. Just do nothing at all. Let natural selection take out the bees that can't handle the mite, and things will balance out. I know it sounds harsh, but it actually works. Unlike wiping out thousands of hives, this kind of natural selection doesn't just happen on paper. Beekeepers who let their hives take care of themselves also saw results. For example, in the early 1990s, a beekeeper in Navasota, Texas, let mites go wild in 1,000 of his colonies. Only 9 of them survived the first year, and from those survivors, he bred bees that were resistant to mites, and after that, the parasites posed no threat to his apiary. It's true that natural selection can mean losing valuable bee species that took decades to breed. Naturally, this is a pretty pricey solution, and not many beekeepers are willing to go that route. That's why 110 seminars are being held across the country to give beekeepers, no matter how many hives they have, the info on the best ways to monitor and treat mite infestations. Fighting parasites, even just controlling them, calls for more hive monitoring, checking them 3 times as often, and using chemicals costing about $55 per hive each year. Beekeepers with less than 10 hives will need to check all of them, while those with over 10 must check 10% of their hives. And all this doesn't mean the invasion's over. Well, it's just an attempt to learn how to live with it. Beekeepers should also brace themselves for dealing with plenty of reinfestations until the wild honeybee population dies off, which could take about 5 years. The industry's likely to get smaller, but it won't vanish entirely. Beekeepers in other countries like New Zealand have been successfully fighting mites for several decades now, so there are already proven methods. These include pesticides made from synthetic or natural compounds. Other ways to tackle the issue involve non-chemical methods, like heating the hives to about 104 degrees Fahrenheit, which doesn't kill the bees, but does wipe out the mites. But if you believe the scientists, it's just a drop in the bucket. When the fight takes decades but doesn't fix the problem, it feels like something's gone wrong. A mite's journey. The Australian state of Victoria, closest to the infected area, is also at risk. Just recently, a case of bees infected with the Varroa mite was reported, which happened a few weeks after the mass transportation of hives for pollination began. In August 2024, over 200,000 hives were moved by truck to the Sunraysia region, which covers northwest Victoria and southwest New South Wales. The plan was for the bees to pollinate almond and stone fruit orchards, but along with the perks, the state also got a headache. It's interesting that the Varroa mite, which made its way into Victoria, was first found outside New South Wales. You'd think this is a disaster since the parasite's new to the area. However, in northern Victoria, there are 12 specialists from the state's Department of Agriculture actively working to help beekeepers tackle the issue. Also, the restrictions on beekeepers buying chemicals to fight the pest have been lifted. And to give you an idea of how serious this problem is, I'll say that federal authorities allocated $100 million to hire just 32 specialists who will get rid of the pests. Judging by the cost, these are basically professional mite assassins. It would make for an interesting spin-off of John Wick. Smart hives. People can be pretty bad at dealing with all sorts of pests, but bees handle it way better. Still, they need a little help. And what could help more than technology? So in a cargo port in North Queensland, they've set up a unique hive in bright purple powered by artificial intelligence. This innovation could be the key to protecting the multi-million-dollar honey production. But how's it going to work? Equipped with cameras on the top and bottom, the hives analyze every bee coming in and out. The system recognizes insects infected with mites and sends alerts via SMS to beekeepers. This allows for a quick response to the threat of parasite spread. The downside is that you still have to manually search for and eliminate the infected bee later on. Well, technology still needs to catch up here. Besides, the project is just starting to get off the ground, but the tests carried out in Melbourne and New Zealand have already shown its effectiveness. Furthermore, the project, which has received support from the Queensland government, will be rolled out across the country. The creators of the smart beehives hope that they'll make beekeeping easier, because right now they have to check for mites by hand. I really hope this actually works. Flies instead of bees. Imagine if there were no blueberries, avocados, and apples in Australia anymore. These crops, by the way, make up a third of all agricultural plants that depend on bee pollination. The Varroa mite is spreading, and it might turn out that there's no one around to pollinate all these plants, which means no harvest. But local agrarians didn't want to just sit back and let that happen, so they came up with something pretty strange, namely an alternative way to pollinate. Yes, I said that honeybees are the best pollinators, but if they suddenly disappeared, we'd need to be prepared to find a replacement. Flower flies have become one of the top candidates for that role. They aren't bees or wasps, basically none of those stinging Hymenoptera, though they do look very similar. But could they pollinate as well as bees? It sounds strange, but there's actually some logic to it. Despite insufficient research, flower flies were chosen from among more than 20,000 Australian species, each with unique feeding preferences and habitats. Adult flower flies feed mainly on nectar and pollen, so they visit flowers to get it. And although a lot of people find flies unpleasant, these little flower visitors could make a valuable contribution to national food security. People who don't know much about insects probably wouldn't even tell the difference. After all, flower flies are striped. They're actually a classic example of a Batesian mimicry, where a harmless species pretends to be dangerous to survive. But who knows, maybe flower flies just plan to steal bees' jobs. One more advantage flies have over bees is that they can work through winter. Bees stay completely inactive during that season, so having pollinators around all year is appealing to farmers for plenty of reasons. Bee backpacks. The number of bees around the world is going down, and scientists are fully aware of it. They also know it could disrupt farming and lead to food shortages. But unlike other countries which are seeing colony collapse disorder, Australia's insect population isn't shrinking, even with the varroa mite around. How did they figure this out? Simple. They made special backpacks for the bees, which are essentially tiny sensors. These gadgets were attached to the bees' backs in the area around Hobart on the island of Tasmania, and then the bees were released back into the wild. A total of 5,000 bees got this upgrade, making it way easier for specialists to track and study their behavior and activity. It's possible that this innovation could offer a solution to the problem of bee mortality worldwide. How did scientists manage to put sensors on bees? I mean, they're bees, they sting. They used a special technique to attach the devices. The insects were placed in a chilled environment for a short time.
This temporarily lowered their activity, making it easier to attach the tiny backpacks.
Afterward, the bees were perfectly fine and got back to their usual bee business. So you could say the method's completely harmless. The sensors don't affect the bees' ability to fly or do their normal duties. Besides bees, they want to study other insects like fruit flies. The size of the bee backpack is only 0.003 square inches, and they're planning to make it half that size for the flies. Too bad they can't make it bigger. I'd love to have one for myself, too. I can't wait for you to hit that like button. You've made it this far, so you should. See you later.